Welcome to This Week in Hearing and our special series titled Giants in Audiology. I'm Bob Traynor, your host for this episode. Today, my guest is Dr. Marshall Chasin, a Canadian audiologist from Toronto, Canada, who has become the Canadian musician's audiologist. And he tells me that he has a black belt in karate and kung fu and plays several instruments, including the clarinet, the guitar, and actually the radio as well. Thanks so much for being with us today, Marshall.
No, it's my pleasure, Bob.
So before we begin, let me read Dr. Chasin's bio. Dr. Marshall Chasin, head of audiology at Musicians Clinics of Canada, and is an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto and Western University in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Chasin holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mathematics and Linguistics from the University of Toronto and a Master of Science degree in Audiology and Speech Sciences from the University of British Columbia. He further has the AuD from the University of Arizona Health Sciences Center. He's the author of 200 articles and 8 books, including Music and Hearing Aids, that is out through Plural Publishing in San Diego. He's a featured columnist in Hearing Review. His column is titled Back to Basics, and also the developer of an interesting app for iPhones and so on, that he'll hopefully tell us a little bit about, called Temporary Hearing Loss Test. Dr. Chasin has received numerous awards, including, and if I pronounce this correctly, Marshall, the 1991 Eve Cassirier Award for Speech and Audiology Canada, the 2004 Professional Leadership Award from the Audiology Foundation of America, 2009 President's Award from the Canadian Academy of Audiology, and something that sounds pretty important to me, the 2012 Queen Elizabeth II Silver Jubilee Award. Also, the 2013 Jos Millar Award from the British Society of Audiology, and the 2017 Canada 150 Medal. Thanks again so much for being with us here today, Marshall. And I think where we want to start with this whole thing is, where did this all begin? And we all have those important things that happen to us when we're like even little kids and so on. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about where the beginnings were and a little bit about how some of these things began to develop.
Well, I started, unlike most people in this field, not having heard anything about audiology. I was in grad school and I'd still not heard of audiology. I didn't know what they did or even what the word meant. I thought they worked in stereo shops. I had no sense of audiology. But when I was growing up, I like a lot of kids, didn't particularly do well or like school. In the earlier years, I couldn't read and write until I was in grade 3 or 4. I was very delayed in that respect. I was the youngest in the family, and that tends to happen, especially if you're born near the end of the year where everyone else in the class is up to a year, almost a year older than you are. But I did excel at mathematics, and I recall at maybe 1 or 2 or one of the earlier years being told that I scored in the top several students in the school board in mathematics and mathematical reasoning. Now, of course, that in that sense, it wasn't really math, it was more arithmetic. And I guess that continued on for a while. I gradually did better as the years wore on. I became a little bit more mature as a student, I guess. But I always was more biased towards the sciences rather than the arts. Actually,
that may have been a little bit because Dad, I think, was an engineering physicist, and then maybe some of the arts things came from Mom with her continuous quoting of Shakespeare, as we talked about in the past. So
that is true. My mother didn't have any formal education beyond high school at that time. It wasn't thought that girls could go to school, at least her family, which is unfortunate. But she would quote Lady Macbeth even from a very early age, just loved Shakespeare and loved some of the poetry and the prose from the previous century. So I was inundated with that from a very early age. My father, of course, was a scientist. He was an engineering physicist. And after World War II, he started working in various locations. And actually, in the 1960s, he decided that he had enough of engineering physics, and he retired as the vice president of a large financial organization, using the same techniques and same technologies as a physicist, only applied to the economic field.
Cool. So, so I guess then, because of that orientation, you were kind of a very young mathematical wizard.
I don't know if I was a wizard, but certainly math came very easy to me, and I always enjoyed math. Actually, I kind of joked that when I was very young, my mother would tell me bedtime stories of acoustics. In fact, I wrote a little bit about that. If you go to my website, www.musiciansclinics.com, both word musicians and clinics.com, go over to publications and scroll all the way down to the bottom, where we have 5 or 6 humorous articles. One of them is about the bedtime stories my mother used to tell me when I was very, very young, about earmold acoustics and hearing aid acoustics. Now, of course, it wasn't really. I could have made that up, but it could have happened.
Yeah. But also, high school found you as a pretty good swimmer as well, from what I understand.
Yeah. I did take up swimming very early. I teach so well, so that was pretty easy. I became a lifeguard in my high school time, and later a swimming instructor. And I actually carried that on all the way through undergraduate university. And I think the last time I taught swimming was my final year of undergraduate. So that's always been a nice summer job for me, a part-time job off to the side. I was also, I know it sounds nerdy, I apologize, but I was the typical president of the chess clubs. And I did very well. I had a fairly good rating in the Canadian Chess Federation at that time. Certainly not at the master's level, but it was quite high.
Well, that kind of goes along with the mathematics, I think, Marshall, because chess is a very complex, strategic kind of a game, and many of us would like to be at least reasonable at chess, and because now we might not have thought it was so cool in high school because we all wanted to be the quarterback on the high school football team. However, these days, that's quite a fabulous skill for strategic implementation. So you decided to take up some karate, I think, as a teenager as well.
Well, not as a teenager, actually. Karate I never took up until I was in my mid-40s. And of course, I was the chauffeur for my son who wanted to take up karate. He was 11 or 12 at the time. And I would, sitting in the waiting room while he was having karate lessons, I would peek in there and I could do that. And so I started to train about 3 or 4 months after he had started. And our sensei, that's the chief karate instructor, was always very careful about not pairing us together. Occasionally, during sparring sessions, we were paired together. And I'm still nursing a broken rib on my left-hand side because of a wonderful kick by Simon. But usually, we weren't paired together. When he hit university age, he actually took off and he didn't, he no longer trains in karate. But I've continued it since my early 40s. So I've been a black belt for the last 15, 20 years.
Wow.
Karate and Kung Fu, a little bit of judo and some weapon work as well.
Well, I hope that we'll only end up being in situations where we have academic fights rather than other kinds of things. So that was warning to all our colleagues out there. Don't mess around with Marshall because he knows the martial arts. So
it's very good. Thank you for.
So,
as if I'd never heard that joke before.
Oh, I bet you have. I bet you have all the time.
I'm only authorized to beat up 5-year-old kids because the 7-year-olds, they come after you. So I'm not that good.
So also about that time, you picked up the guitar as well.
Yeah, in high school, I picked up the guitar. It's one of those instruments you can teach yourself. And I remember sitting down one day and learning the 12 chords that are necessary to learn how to play the guitar. And you can do a lot with even 3 or 4 chords, 7 by 12. And so I started to play the guitar. Of course, in junior high school, I was in the band playing the clarinet. And they are different instruments, of course. They have major differences between them. Clarinet's not the coolest thing to play at a party, whereas guitar kind of is more cool to play at a party. You can also sing along with the guitar. You can't sing along with a clarinet. I thought it was pretty good as a clarinet player, but whenever the opportunity arose, my music teacher would always shove me one clarinet section back. So second clarinet, third clarinet. I think Beethoven has something called the Egmont Overture, three-piece. It has a fourth clarinet part, and guess who got to play fourth clarinet? I think the fifth clarinet got kind of they are in the hallway and in the cloak closet with washing down the hall. So I guess the writing was on the wall that I wouldn't be the best clarinet player, but I enjoy it, and actually I play it to this day. I'd like to pick up my clarinet and my guitar.
And probably a little bit of Benny Goodman and some of those other things going along with that clarinet playing, I'm sure.
Not as good as I think Benny Goodman, but I saw these great clarinet players in the 1940s and 30s were wonderful. I'm maybe about 1/10 their skill level.
Well, so that'll be a good thing for some party sometime to see how well we put on a record with Benny and we listen to Marshall play a clarinet. But I understand too, like in high school, your mathematics skills were pretty amplified as well.
Yeah, I was the typical nerd who went into all the math contests and tried to solve these unusual problems that we used to have. I remember there was a time where I solved an unsolvable conjecture. Of course, I was very naive and I thought I had solved it. And I did solve part of it. I remember my math teacher being quite impressed, but when I got to university and took real math, I realized that I'd already solved the easy part and only a small fraction of it. But it was a start, and it kind of gave me the positive reinforcement to continue on with math. Math is not the type of field you go into lightly. You have to really kind of be dedicated to it in order to do those constant math problems, and some of the concepts in math are a little bit abstract, I think is a better way of saying it than anything else. But I enjoyed it. It was a wonderful way of spending high school. I wasn't a complete nerd in high school. Well, I was, but not a complete nerd. I was on the swim team as well, breaststroke and front freestyle, which is front crawl. I didn't do very well, but again, I was cool enough to be on the swim team.
So from there, you moved on to the University of Toronto for your undergraduate studies.
Yeah, I think it was a given that I would go to the University of Toronto. My father had gone there. One of my sisters had gone there. It was just assumed that I would go there. And they did have a very strong mathematics department at that time. Unfortunately, it was the mid-70s where most of the professors, English was not their first or second or sometimes third language. And so most of my professors spoke German. Some were from Switzerland. And I remember, for some strange reason, always doing better in those courses where we had Swiss German professors. Something about their language, their speech. I just loved listening to it. You'd walk in and you'd say, "We will now study differential equations." Enjoy. And there's just something musical about his voice, and you just listen so intently. And so a lot of the courses that could be difficult, otherwise, I had some wonderful teachers, at least in some courses.
And let's see it. And you even ended up with a mathematics and linguistics orientation at Toronto. So kind of a combination of both of those things.
Nowadays, my background probably would have been called cognitive sciences, linguistics. But back then, it was just called mathematics and linguistics. So I did take a fair number of linguistics courses in my undergraduate. My preference is and always has been phonetics and a bit of phonology, but mostly phonetics. I'm a great lover of the movie My Fair Lady, based on Shaw's book, Valiant. And I view myself a little bit as Professor Higgins. Not that I try to teach Eliza Doolittle how to speak better for different class of British society, but I liked the rhythm of language and the rhythm of speech. And in fact, in mathematics, most of my orientation was towards algebras, formal algebras. Now, in mathematics, we call them formal algebras. A linguist might call them the syntax. And interestingly enough, even though that was my interest, I took my fair share of syntax courses, but I think my passion was always speech patterns or phonetics or sound patterns. And when it came to graduate after 4 years, I had three options. I could go into teachers college and become a high school math teacher, but it was the late 70s and nobody was hiring math teachers, but I could have seen myself as a math teacher with my career. I could have gone into my master's of mathematics. And in fact, I received a full scholarship into mathematics. But at that time, all the great math problems were being solved by non-mathematicians. So there's something called the four-color conjecture. It's really easy to prove three-color conjecture. It's trivial to do the five-color conjecture, but the four-color conjecture, and you have a map with four adjacent colors that are not the same color side by side. Was not proven. Now, this is actually a very important conjecture in practicality when we schedule. So, for example, I have to take an exam on Tuesday. Well, I can take the exam on Tuesday because I'm taking this course, which is in exclusion of another course that I was not allowed to take. And so maybe they'll put that other course at the same time. So this way, the scheduling would mean that you wouldn't have two courses at the same time. But at that time in the late 70s, all the big math problems, such as the four-color conjecture, were being solved by the upstarts from down the hall, the computer science department. And it wasn't very elegant. They did it and they proved it, but it wasn't very elegant. So I saw the writing on the wall. So my third option was to do my master's of linguistics, which I did choose to do. I was intending to look at formal algebras, formal syntaxes, but then very quickly I realized that my passion was more phonetics and acoustic phonetics than anything else. In fact, when I went to linguistics department, I wrote quite a few computer science programs. We used to call it programming. Now I know we call it coding, but in the day we used to call it programming. And I wrote a text editor to parse a language so that we can do a syntactic analysis. My thesis was actually a simulation I wrote of the vocal cavity and the nasal tract, and I was able to develop a numerical analysis of the human vocal tract. So I was able to change the dimensions and the parameters and to look at certain outputs and how they would differ. That actually became part of my master's thesis when I did linguistics.
Yeah, and I also understand there was kind of in Canada, you guys have some interesting kinds of requirements for degrees, and there was a French requirement that was required for the master's program too, right?
Indeed, and that is the case in linguistics to this day, but certainly in the 70s, I knew that my future as a PhD would be impossible because I did not know two other languages other than English, and that was a requirement. The linguistics department had accepted mathematics as one of my languages, which was very nice. But although my reading French isn't too bad, my speaking and writing French, not the best. Well, it's actually very poor. And I tried to pass the French language requirement. I didn't. And I knew the writing was on the wall. So I started to look elsewhere, knowing that my advanced degree in linguistics at that time in Canada would have been problematic. My Latin wasn't too bad, actually, and I could have used that, but I don't think Latin was acceptable as a modern conversational form of Latin at that time. Actually, most of my Latin is self-taught, but my writing and reading of Latin wasn't too bad, actually. So I guess I could have done that. But I was looking around, and my graduate advisor said, "Had you ever heard of audiology?" And I said, "I don't want to look in the stereo shop." I just didn't know what an audiologist was.
Well, I have to tell you that used to be here. What I would ask when someone would ask me, "What do you do?" I would say, "I'm an audiologist," and they would say, "Well, what kind of stereos do you sell?" And so that was kind of a common thread that went through what an audiologist was early on.
I would say Canada in the 70s, we maybe had 30 or maybe 40 audiologists in the entire country, with the majority of them being American trained. we did have several Canadian, well, 3 or 4 actually, Canadian programs, but we never had an undergraduate in communication disorders. So I was never had the opportunity to take any speech language pathology or audiology courses in the undergraduate, other than the linguistics courses, the perception courses I normally took, and courses that I guess would be called speech language pathology, such as language acquisition, but we never encased it into an undergraduate communication disorders program. So when I was in graduate school, one of my graduate advisors suggested audiology. I looked into it, and actually it looked really interesting. It was a nice combination between the arts and the sciences. It was a people field, so I knew I would be sitting in front of a computer screen the rest of my life, like I would be, let's say, in mathematics. And so I applied to actually several programs. I applied to Purdue in the States and they turned me down. I had a straight A. I don't know why they turned me down to this day, and I usually razz them.
Yes, we'll have to ask Goldstein that.
I did.
Somewhere along the line.
Yeah. He's no longer with us, unfortunately.
Oh, I know.
But I did mention this to him and embarrassed him over a beer one day, and it was a very positive statement. But they did accept me at the University of British Columbia on the other end of the country, in the west side of the country. And for the first time, I saw mountains and oceans, something I'd actually never seen before. Toronto is a relatively flat environment. We do have certain hills, but the hills are 30 or 40 feet tall.
You know, one of the things that I think develops many of us in many areas is that some of us don't come from traditional speech and hearing programs. We bring some of the skills that we obtained from other areas and post those into the communication disorders, speech and audiology kinds of areas. And what happens is that you take a lot of those things and present them into the profession, which gives the unique perspective and some of the things that you've written about over the last number of years. But I understand that that while you were at the University of British Columbia, you used to kind of play the guitar in the park and things like that to make a couple of bucks, as all of us have to do during graduate school, doing something.
Well, it is true. Funding was not a high priority with the program that I was in, and indeed, but I had saved up, of course, and how my parents helped me a bit. I did have to play guitar in Stanley Park, which is their big park there. I wasn't very good, but you only need to know 2 or 3 songs before people move on. And if you stuck around, you started to tell them math jokes, and they moved along rather quickly. So it was an easy thing to do. I also tutored a lot of undergraduates in statistics, a lot of accounting students, interestingly enough. My name got around for accounting students. I tutored them in statistics so they could pass their requirement of statistics. So I was able to play around outside of audiology. Audiology was kind of interesting. The University of British Columbia program back then was a little bit unusual. It wasn't clinical. It wasn't research. It was theoretical. And actually, I kind of liked that. And that's one of the reasons I chose it. So I didn't really get to push any buttons on an audiometer until well into my second year when we had to do some placements. And giving the background, the theoretical background, the framework before I even got to read about the research, I think was very important. Also, many of the classmates came from different fields. I went to school with someone that came from chemistry. There was someone from Old English. Well, she didn't survive, but that's not because of her background in Old English, but it was a very varied background, getting back to your other question. And in fact, to this day, if you look at some of the people in our field that have really contributed a lot, such as Pete Killian, for example. Mead also went through mathematics, and he only discovered audiology in the late 70s. And with Laura Bilber at Northwestern University. And prior to that, he was a mathematician. Eddie Belcher, who invented multi-bank compression that we use today, is an electrical engineer. Bill Cole, who is one of the fathers of biliary measurements, an engineer. He brings his knowledge base to our field. In fact, Mead Killian was the inventor of the insert earphones that are now ubiquitous in our field. He was responsible for much of the miniaturizations that made hearing aids smaller. And again, that came from outside of our field.
As well as some interesting concepts in hearing aid fitting too. And understand that Mead and as well as Robin Cox were kind of, in addition to your mentors at British Columbia, they were some pretty strong mentors for you in the development of some of the things that you have come to present to the field at this point.
Well, first, University of British Columbia, actually, I have any mentors per se. They tolerated me. Some were afraid of me. But regardless, I did get through, and I think I can thank them for the wonderful overview education that I received there. But when I was there was an article that came out, a monograph that came out in 1979 by Robin Cox. I'd never heard of Robin Cox before. And it was a wonderful monograph about earmold acoustics. And it occurred to me when reading it that the computer simulations that I was doing in my graduate linguistics about the human vocal tract were using the same laws of physics as the earmold acoustics or room acoustics or even musical instruments. And so I read and reread and read again that 1979 monograph. It's not very long. It's only about 30 or 40 pages. But I got in contact with Robin Cox, who was at that point in University of Memphis. And we opened up a kind of a dialogue. This was before the internet, so this was by letter. I know that's the old-fashioned way of doing it, but by letter. And occasionally I would send out some computer cards to her. We used to do all our programming on computer cards back then. Yeah. And I would send her stuff down. She would look at it, not really understand what I was getting at sometimes, but she was always very supportive and very nice. Also in 1979, something else happened. Mead Killian published the first part of his thesis. And it was in his thesis, but I actually didn't publish until 81 when I about to graduate. And I think it was in the Journal of Speech and Hearing Research. And when Mead Killian did his PhD in audiology, he did it in two parts. One was the electrical part, one was the acoustical part. Well, the acoustical part was published in 1981, just as I was graduating. And he essentially developed a whole series of ear molds. And he expanded the field of ear mold acoustics dramatically at that time. And we had Bell molds with filters in them, which means like 8CR, which stands for a bandwidth of 8,000 hertz, now resonance of 3,000 hertz. So the mold itself would give you a flat or etymonic response. And so that was very interesting. And so I have, at that point, but I did notice he made a mistake in his calculations. And I wrote off a little letter to him, showed him as a snot-nosed kid just graduating, and he made a little mistake. And he said, no, I didn't make a mistake, but we don't want to have exactly a 3,000 hertz resonance. We want to have it a little bit off, and these are other reasons. He was, of course, talking about something called the diffuse field, but I didn't know what that was at that time. But he was always very positive, very supportive of me. And usually, and to this day, I wrote a book just very recently last year called Music and Hearing Aids, and Mead was nice enough to write the foreword of that book. So he's always been very good about kind of helping me get back on track if I veered off track, or help to publicize things when I was on track on those few occasions.
Well, I'm sure Mead appreciated the fact that you had much more of an orientation toward mathematics than the rest of us would have had. Most audiologists don't have quite that mathematical orientation. And Mead has always been, to all of us, I think, very tolerant of our weaknesses in some areas. That is a strength for you, where you guys could have actual intellectual conversations. And the rest of us would say, oh, that sounds really neat. That sounds really interesting. And not having half of a clue of what the background was, only actually what the result might have been. But after your experience at the University of British Columbia, you took a position at the Canadian Hearing Society.
It was an opportunity to go back home, visit my parents, my family, 4,000 miles away. We think in terms of kilometers, so I had to convert to miles just that. That's why I stuttered a little bit there. But I got a job at the Canadian Hearing Society. It was an excellent first job. I had a wonderful boss, Tanny Nixon, who allowed me the flexibility to do really what I wanted to do. On one hand, I had to learn the ropes. And I think anybody can do out of school. It's a good idea to work with someone else for a period of time to learn the ropes, to see how things are really done, to see some of the subtle things that come up. And then after several years, or 4 or 5 years, you could be being in your own mind, at least as a master audiologist, where you can go off on your own and hopefully allow your patients to get the best services and most reasonable services. So the Canadian Hearing Society is more of a rehabilitative place rather than a medical place. But of course, we did work closely with physicians at that time. So I did learn a lot of the ropes. I also learned a lot of stuff I had never thought about before. So, for example, the Canadian Hearing Society was always advocating for service. They weren't necessarily in favor or against any particular point of view. And I remember one of my professors at the University of British Columbia said, well, we're going to talk about sign language, manual communication, telecommunication, oral communication, oral spelled both ways, ORAL and AURAL. And by the time you graduate, you'll have a preference. Well, by the time I graduated, I didn't have a preference. I just didn't really know. I could see advantages of all different ways. And when I hit the Canadian Hearing Society, at that time, there was a lot of stress with sign language and both communication. And I got to meet a lot of deaf people, capital D deaf, who are culturally deaf. I took quite a bit of sign language as well. But also, and the reason why the Canadian Hearing Society is so pro total communication and sign language was not that they were necessarily pro that, but there were just not enough services for that. And so it was important to them to provide those services to the community. And it was a very interesting place. In my last 2 years at the Canadian Hearing Society, I was on a federal grant on health promotion, where my main role was to go around to whoever would listen to me, schools, tertiary nursing units, nursing homes, other residential care facilities, and just talk about hearing and hearing loss prevention. And so I did get a lot of experience talking to groups and finding out what works and what doesn't work. You can't use big giant words if people aren't not familiar with the jargon. And I actually use that in my terminology today. Certain words I would never use are words like obviate. They look at you and say, what does that mean? So it was a great opportunity at the Canadian Hearing Society. And in 1985, I went out in private practice. My oldest was born, CJ, and I wanted to spend more time with her, which I did. And it was a very good year. I was finding that I could work really about 1 or 2 days a week total and make as much as I did at the Hearing Society full-time as a salaried employee. So I got a lot of chance to spend with my daughter. And then a year later, obviously moved forward, I must admit, and she was becoming a little bit more independent. And I ran into this gentleman named John Chong, another mentor of mine. John is a very interesting gentleman. He's an electrical engineer, got tired of that, went into medicine, and just loved medicine. John, at age 13 or 14, was already a concert pianist and had already reached the highest levels of piano training. In Canada, we call it the associate degree, ARCP. And he did come down, unfortunately, with carpal tunnel syndrome, so he could no longer play like Chopin. And so he had to go across the hall to the composing department of the Conservatory of Music. And so he learned how to compose rather than perform, just due to his physical injury. When he was in med school, he ended up with a degree in internal medicine, or he goes under internal medicine, but his specialty is actually musicians' injuries. And earlier on, he wanted to set up something called the Musicians Clinic to solve some of these, or address some of these musician injuries. And this was 1986. And he asked me to come along for the ride. And initially I said no, because if you have an electrical engineer or a lawyer or a musician is a fine, boy, is that difficult. You really have to know your audio.
I think all of our colleagues will agree that musicians are a difficult component of the hearing impaired population, and it takes special kind of orientation. And of course, the engineers are right there as well. The person who comes in and says, I think if you tweak this at 1553 hertz, then I think I'm going to be okay. That kind of a person. So yes, they're that difficult group.
And that's why I said no. But he's bigger than I was, and he got me a little bit drunk and said, "Okay, I'll come out and look at it and see what we can do." And the first patient I saw was a really interesting patient. He had come in initially with wrist and arm problems. He was a violinist. He was sawing away at the violin, but he also had tinnitus in his left ear. Of course, he's holding a noise generator by his left ear. To make a long story short, I was hooked. I found that the solutions and the forms of assessment that were reasonable that I could do as an audiologist were exactly everything I'd ever learned in audiology. So you had to know about critical bandwidth, room acoustics, reception issues, and how the cochlea functions, of what we knew at that time about tinnitus, which was, of course, before Jasper Bobson Hazel's 1993 publication. So tinnitus masking was quite rudimentary, but every element of what we learned in school was very useful. And of course, as I said before, the acoustics, the laws of acoustics of the vocal tract are the same laws of acoustics we learned in our room acoustics class, and it's the same acoustics that we see in musical instruments. So to describe musical instruments or to understand what they're hearing with their own musical instrument, it's those same laws of earmold, room acoustics, or vocal tract acoustics that we can apply. And I actually have been part of the musicians clinics of Canada since the mid-'80s. And even today, I see certain things. Interestingly enough, there was a bit of a change going on with musicians and the musicians clinic. In the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of it was physical injuries, overuse symptoms, so that a drummer would come in and he'd be hitting too hard on a rim shot or a hi-hat, and he'd have wrist and arm problems. And I recall one person in particular who read it in its modern magazine, Modern Drummer, still is in existence today, a magazine. You have to wear hearing protection. So he went out and got his father's industrial strength PAR home plugs and started to put them on. And it lessened the level of his playing, but it took off so many monitoring cues of his drum kit. And so specifically his rim shot. So he started hitting harder on the rim shot than he needed to because he couldn't hear it very well. And that resulted in wrist and arm problems. Well, the solution was to fit him with the proper type of earplug, one of the flat uniform earplugs of the era, or the ER, in that case 25, made by a manufacturer called Etymologic Research, Italian's company. And it gave him a better monitoring ability of his instrument, at the same time gave him sufficient hearing protection, and his wrist and arm problems went away. So there are some interactions between physical injuries and monitoring that what an audiologist can do. Recently, however, most of the musicians that we see at the musicians clinic, me especially, are stress related. Now, I think we've had 2 or 3 generations of students over the last 40 years almost grow up on knowing that they have to wear hearing protection. They now learn about school, whether it's at college or community level, they have to learn about hearing protection and other health concerns that a musician may have. But most musicians nowadays are on the gig economy, whether they're street performers or musicians or whatever, and they play in the park, whatever. The successful musician that's in the gig economy may only make $16,000 or $17,000 a year. And in most large cities like Toronto, that's below the poverty line. So there are major stresses on musicians nowadays that perhaps we didn't have as much in the 1980s or 1990s. Inflation has really, especially the rents and the cost of housing and food, has really skyrocketed of late. And many musicians don't know where the next deal will come from or whether they can make rent on a certain month. So you can't look at a musician and just look at the hearing in isolation. You have to look at the whole being. And so a lot of what we do at the Musicians Clinic is stress reduction. Now, in the 1960s, for those of you that remember the 1960s, there was big ads in the newspaper. Bob, you remember the 1960s? Big headlines saying stress, the big killer. And they were referring to how stress can affect your heart, your lungs, your kidney, your liver. But of course, it didn't say anything about hearing. But actually in 2009 and another article in 2010, so more than a decade ago, not in the audiology journals, in the cell biology journals, the mechanism for how stress may affect your auditory system came out. And it turns out that high levels of stress means that your adrenal glands will emit cortisol, a stress hormone. Through a complex biochemical process, the cortisol gets into the brain and creates high levels of glutamate. Glutamate, we know, is one of the important neurotransmitter substances in our hearing mechanism. And it turns out that high levels of glutamate, whether it's caused by loud noise or caused by stress, is identical at the smallest molecular level. And in both cases, calcium ions rushing into a cell, beginning the depolarization or cell death process. So it turns out that people that are very stressed could have things like tinnitus. Now, these are people not with a hearing loss, not like you expect a 70 or 80-year-old person to have, maybe the tinnitus, but I'm talking about a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old young musician just starting out with a lot of stresses on his life, and they have very high levels of cortisol in their body for good reason. At least in North America, musicians are not well respected and certainly are not well paid. But they have high levels of cortisol, leading to high levels of glutamate, and they come in tinnitus. So a lot of what I do now is to resolve the tinnitus, not just using masking perpetuation, not acknowledging that it's an increase in central gain as it would be with other forms of tinnitus, but more importantly, stress reduction techniques. And now in Canada, marijuana is legal, but that can be useful. Although if you are going to get involved with this, I know that 38 states in the United States have some degree of legality of marijuana as well, depending on their policies. But marijuana is made with two things: the THC, which is the stoning agent, and there is no benefit to that. There never has been any research benefit to the stoning agent, the THC. But there is a lot of research suggesting that the CBD or the cannabinoid can be very useful at suppressing tinnitus, suppressing stress, helping you sleep deeper and longer, which has positive effects. And there's research also done by one of the physicians at the Musicians Clinics of Canada, Dr. Kat Patel, that showed that high levels of cannabinoid, CBD, and that's why we call it CBD. The high levels of CBD of 30 or 40 milligrams per dose, but very, very, very low levels of THC, the stoner agent, let's say less than 2.5 milligrams per dose, can be very, very useful for many people. So many of my young musicians have this CBD that help, maybe in the form of an oil, perhaps, that they take before they go to bed, that helps them sleep deeper, sleep longer, and their overall stress level is lower. So audiology is kind of bordering now more so than ever before on the pharmaceutical side of things, at least in Canada it is with CBD. There are so many chemical earmuffs as well coming down the pipeline that we're getting into the otoprotectants. But of course, with those, you have to be very careful because it's the dose that matters. So I can talk about NAC, LNAC, for example, which has been known for years and years and years with all sorts of people. I can suggest that they try NAC, but unless I tell them what the dosage of NAC, it's problematic. Too much is no good. Too little is no good. There's usually a sweet spot. And so as the research comes out about these otoprotectant, these chemical earmuffs, these pharmaceuticals, that can be very useful. There's an article, actually, that's a headline article in this month's Canadian Audiologist. And for those that don't know, of my many roles, I'm the editor-in-chief of CanadianAudiologist.ca. It's one word. And it's free, and it's the official publication of Canadian Academy of Audiology. And if you listen to this after the current issue is no longer there, go to past issues and pull it up by someone named Colleen Lafrell. Colleen is a true giant in our field, and she's in the University of North Texas in Dallas. And she's written a wonderful article for us about pharmaceuticals and how that can mitigate future hearing loss. And not just hearing loss, but the things that go along with hearing loss, the tinnitus and other negative things as well.
You mentioned some things about the Canadian audiologist, but I know you've been extremely active in the development of audiology across Canada, and particularly with the Canadian Academy of Audiology.
The Canadian Academy of Audiology started about 18 years ago by now, just shortly after but much after the American Academy of Audiology. And I think I would have to thank them because it was some of the people like Dr. Jim Jerger of the American Academy of Audiology that is very instrumental in helping us get the Canadian version off the ground. The Canadian Academy of Audiology, as that journal I've alluded to, we do have annual conferences. We have many position and policy papers, and the papers are very, very high level and very well thought out. So we have, even though over-the-counter hearing aids is not yet in Canada, and may never hit Canada, we do have a well thought out, well considered position papers on that topic. We're looking at ones on the relationship, if any, between cognition and untreated hearing loss, which there's, I guess, according to the recent achieved results from Dr. Frank Lynn from Johns Hopkins University, there hasn't been much of a relationship. It doesn't show much of a relationship between cognitive decline and hearing loss, other than hearing better will help you think better. That is true. But we have position papers on that. So the Canadian Academy of Audiology has been very, very supportive of those endeavors. Within the Canadian Academy of Audiology, as I said, we do have many departments, many wings that have various orientations, such as vestibular group. We have a small to growing CAPD group. We have a larger amplification group, of course. That seems to be my interest as well. We don't have as large of musicians and hearing loss performing artists and hearing loss prevention group as I would like to see, but I think you'll see that in the future.
Well, but you've also done some things with the American Academy of Audiology as well, giving us some orientation and probably using those mathematics and linguistic skills to kind of focus us in a maybe a little bit different direction and so on.
Well, it is true. Over the years, I have given many talks for the various conferences of the American Academy of Audiology and have written in some of their journals and their magazine, Audiology Today. One of the topics that I have presented there several times, which was, I think, well received, is not what you normally think of audiology, or you would think of audiology, but you wouldn't necessarily put it together. But I've done a lot of work and written book chapters on the how you fit hearing aids differently for different languages. Now, you have to analyze what is important about languages. There has been a little bit of work on that in the past with tonal languages, with having more low frequency applications. So you might have program 1 for English and program 2 for, let's say, Chinese, which is a tonal language. Well, the tones are very meaningful, and they're always on the lower frequency, either vowels or nasals. In both cases, they're the sonorant, the lower frequency sounds. And so an enhanced low frequency and bandwidth of the frequency response for Chinese versus English might be very useful. I extended that to something beyond the phonetic level. I've gone to the level of the morpheme and also the level of the sentence. So, for example, there are many languages around the world that are restricted by consonant vowel structure. Hawaiian, Japanese being another one of them. In Japanese, even if they borrow a word like McDonald's into their language, they impose the morphology of Japanese onto it. So McDonald's having two consonants side by side is a no-no. So they would call it Makono Gono Lotos, if I said that correctly. Or handbag is another example, and no bago. where you never have two consonants side by side in that language. Well, what that means, though, in terms of compression, is that we want to ensure that the compressor has a very quick release time compared to English, much faster release time. So the quieter adjacent consonant, which might be of a lower sound level, and has sufficient audibility in the system. So that could be one of the other changes. Another change would be at the sentence level. So English being a subject, verb, object language, we have objects at the end of our sentences, and we all always run out of air by the time we get out at the end of the sentence anyway. It's quieter. But if we have an object, especially a proper noun with a name, John saw Mary, it gets louder again. But most languages, if we don't have a noun or a proper noun or an object at the end of a sentence, it gets very, very quiet. So you take the languages that are subject, object, verb oriented, such as, again, Japanese, Korean, Armenian, Turkish. It goes on and on. There are many, many languages that have that characteristic. They have very quiet levels at the end of a sentence. So when we talk about sufficient gain for soft level inputs, we're not just talking about for soft speech, but we're talking about sentence final speech in these languages. And so these languages would need more gain for soft level inputs on their compressor, how we set them up then for English. So if we had a bilingual.
I even see, Marshall, I even see now some of the hearing aid software is actually asked some questions about is this total, what language is the individual speaking almost. There's a couple of the manufacturer software that seem to do that now.
That is true. And that's because of my work and by working with them. So you don't have to really listen to what I just said or understand what I just said, but you just enter Turkish and we're automatically give you more gain for soft level inputs being sentence final inputs. So that's some of the stuff I've presented mostly at the American Academy of Audiology. I've written about them. There's actually one thing that's been very interesting that just happened earlier this morning. I have written in the past about musical roads. Now, this isn't really Audiology 101. It's even before Audiology 101. This is something that you can do in junior high school, where high school kids can do the calculations once they're taking their first science course about the physics of sound. There are musical roads all over our world where grooves are in the pavement are drilled into or carved into roads.
Yeah, and I think you just did this for the Munich airport, as I recall.
Exactly. So these are cars going 100 kilometers an hour, or in the States, 60 miles an hour, and it plays a certain song. And so the Munich airport approached me for a Oktoberfest celebration, and there's a pathway now that leads from Terminal 1 to Terminal 2 at the Munich airport, where you could drag your bag, on wheels, over a pathway, and going 4 or 5 kilometers an hour, you get 2 or 3 miles an hour, your own walking speed. And as you drag your suitcase over, it plays unprocessed, or the roll out the barrel song. Roll out the barrel today.
Yeah, cool.
Singer, as you can see.
That sounds like something from Munich for sure, particularly with the Oktoberfest and all the their famous kind of beer halls and that kind of thing. And I think some of our first interactions was, I think, at one time at the tinnitus meeting in Iowa, but probably the place we got to know each other a little more was when we were all partners in the Hearing Health and Technology Matters group. There were 9 of us that were all involved in that. Many of us had our own little blogs and so on, and yours is still going and going rather well. But HHTM has been kind of a part of all of us at one time or another.
Oh, most definitely. I do thank HHTM, HHTM, Hearing Health Matters, Hearing Health and Technology Matters. That's what the G stands for. But it's hham.org. You can get to that. But every week, or in my case, I've slowed down a little bit. I apologize. Every month, I have another contribution. But there are contributions about busy issues. Gail Hannon has written wonderful articles about what it's like to be a consumer of hearing aids. I, of course, have one called Hear the Music, which is all about music and music-related things. There are historical articles in there. There's current events in our hearing aid industry at ejkm.org. It's a wonderful organization. And for years, every week, we've come out with a new blog. And it's still going strong today. And you can subscribe to that through an RSS feed, and it'll come to your inbox weekly with, in many cases, new blogs. There was also a review of many of the new patents that are found in the field. Just so many different aspects that people build on.
And when we decided to move on from ownership there, Kevin Levy has taken that HHTM to a new level as well, and also added the This Week in Hearing component to it, which I think kind of brings things into almost a different component of the new century. But Holly Hotsford Dunn, who hustled all of us to kind of put this together, I think did a fabulous job of organizing this and that. Of course, Wayne Staub was involved with that as well. And now I understand that this. Can you tell us a little bit about the tinnitus, not the tinnitus, but the temporary threshold shift application that you set up with that you have organized?
About 10 years ago, I thought of the concept that wouldn't it be interesting instead of to be able to measure a TTS, a temporary threshold shift on someone. Now, of course, the practicality, you have your hearing tested, you have to go away someplace to have some music or some noise exposure, and very quickly after have your hearing tested a second time, and the difference between the first and second time being a measure of your temporary threshold shift. I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to have an app for that? And so I developed an app called Temporary Hearing Loss Test app. And it's available both in Android and iOS. Although I must admit, currently there's a glitch in the background programming of it that I have to redo it and update. It's only working on the older operating systems now. It's not unfortunately currently available, but that will change shortly. But the idea behind it is that you listen to your phone and you play a 6,000 hertz signal, either to earphones or in just normal with a loudspeaker in a certain location, and you reduce the volume until it's no longer audible. So you find your threshold of hearing before at 6,000 hertz. Then you go and do whatever it is that's noisy, musically or otherwise, and then you come back and you hit a button that says test hearing again, and the same 6,000 hertz signal comes off, and you can reduce it with a little sphere that you hand drag with your finger, and you find the softer sound, and then it calculates the difference between the before and the after in a measure of TTS. Now, temporary threshold shift is not actually, I shouldn't say necessarily, it's not an indicator of permanent threshold shift. I know that people throughout the 1970s and 80s, such as Dixon Ward, had spent their entire lives, academic lives, trying to find a relationship between temporary hearing shift, temporary hearing loss that we all experience from time to time, and future permanent hearing loss. There is no known relationship. But one thing that we did find is that in order to have a permanent hearing loss down the line, you have had to have had some temporary hearing loss before at some point. So it can be used only in that sense, that it has to be a precursor, not necessarily a predictor of. And so if we found with this TTS app, the Temporary Hearing Loss Test app, that there was no measurable and no significant TTS, then you knew that that location was not potentially damaging. You didn't have the maximum dose. It means, of course, you have to watch yourself for the rest of the week. And if you did go to a rock concert on Friday night, that's cool. Enjoy it thoroughly. Just don't mow your lawn on Saturday or Sunday. You're going to get someone else to do it for you. But if you did have significant amounts of temporary threshold shift, that was an indicator that next time you're in that environment, you should be wearing hearing protection. And then it links back to our musiciansclinics.com website to give you certain strategies to protect your hearing loss going forward.
Well, I think that would be quite helpful to young musicians as they as they begin some of their career, as well as some of the seasoned veterans. Now, but as we begin to kind of wind down our discussion here, Marshall, how do you see the future of the profession? Maybe not just in Canada, but the profession as a general overall view.
I'm actually very, very positive about our profession. I know I've been in it for over 40 years. I think that I'd be a little bit jaded here and there. And there are certain things that can be a little bit problematical, such as the advent of over-the-counter hearing aids, that many audiologists, in order to make their rent and their salary, have had to revert to dispensing hearing aids as well, or other accessories. And there are other financial pressures that probably would not as big of an issue years and years and years ago. But I think that audiology is such a wonderful place to be, because it's at the crossroads of engineering, mathematics, linguistics, psychology, perception. There's not one field I can think of really where audiology doesn't touch upon. I think people with a degree or training in audiology do so many things. I've done quite a bit of forensic work, for example, where I'm using much of what I learned in Audiology 101. I still run a full clinic. I have full offices, and I'm very busy week seeing patients. There's something about seeing a patient, deluding a kid into stopping crying so that you can do a full auditory test. So they'll be happier about it and maybe want it back for follow-up, 3, 4, 5 weeks later. I like working with musicians. I do see my share of non-musicians as well. And the reality of the situation is that I've got to see my share of other people in order to pay the bill so that I can see the musician. You do spend it in order, or just a proportionate amount of time working with musicians, but it's worth it. And someone's got to do it. And I would say that how I view a musician or how I work with a musician can really only be made possible because I know everything I know from audiology and from how I was trained. So I see the future of audiology as very positive. I think the schools of audiology, at least in Canada, are well subscribed to. It's very difficult to get into these fields. I think that the majority of people that do graduate work for many, many years in this field, and they're very happy about it. And they want to go to work at the end of a long day. With me, it's 40 years later, plus 4 years later, I still enjoy going to work every single day and see patients.
Yeah, I think that's the thing I miss the most about patients is that not only do you see the easy patients, but you see the difficult ones, you see the ones in the middle, and you see the whole future of everything. And anyway, I certainly want to thank you for being with us today, Marshall, and enlightening us on how a mathematician and a linguist can actually teach us a lot about how to maybe work with musicians, but in addition to working with our regular patients. So again, thanks so much for being with us. This week, my guest has been Dr. Marshall Chasin, audiologist at the Musicians Clinics of Canada, and also a columnist in the Hearing Review, HHTM, and a number of other places. I would encourage you to review some of his materials because they can enlighten all of us. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you, Marshall, for being with us at This Week in Hearing.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.